USS Wasp was the sole member of her class, and a direct result of the interwar treaties. She came about as a result of the U.S. Navy having 15,000 tons left in their carrier tonnage allotment under the Washington Naval Treaty, after USS Langley was converted to a seaplane tender in 1937. And even though the U.S. had just commissioned Ranger a few years prior and knew that 15,000 tons was not enough tonnage to build the carrier they wanted, the thought process was that having something was better than having nothing. With war on the horizon, the Navy was clearly seeking to get every ton out of the tonnage they were awarded under the Washington Treaty. These conditions led directly to Wasp easily being the most vulnerable aircraft carrier ever built by the United States. She was essentially a slimmed-down version of the Yorktown class, but could carry an air group similar in size. This was possible due to the space and weight saved by designing her with a smaller propulsion plant, little to no armor, and zero torpedo protection. Those last two items would prove to be fatal on a September afternoon in 1942. Her keel was laid down on April 1, 1936 at the Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, and she was launched 3 years later in April 1939. She was 741 feet long overall, had a beam of 81 feet at the waterline, and displaced just under 15,000 tons. Her flight deck was 727 feet long and 109 feet wide. As mentioned earlier, Wasp was built with an undersized propulsion plant in order to save space and weight. She was rated for 75,000 shaft horsepower, which was a bit more than Ranger, but she was still considerably underpowered when compared to Yorktown and Enterprise's propulsion plants that were rated for 120,000 shaft horsepower. Wasp had a pair of steam turbines that each drove one shaft using the steam provided by 6 oil-fired boilers. Her top speed was 29.5 knots, and she had a cruising range of 12,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. For air defense, Wasp was equipped with 8 5-inch guns, 4 quadruple 1.1-inch mounts, and 24 50 caliber machine guns. She carried about 80 aircraft and had 4 hydraulic catapults to launch them with, 2 on her flight deck and 2 more on her hangar deck. Wasp was the first American carrier to be fitted with a deck edge elevator. The elevator consisted of a platform for the front wheels of the plane and an outrigger for the tail wheel, and it would become a mainstay of all future U.S. carrier designs. Wasp was commissioned into the fleet on April 25, 1940, and spent the next several months fitting out and conducting sea trials off the eastern seaboard, before undertaking her shakedown cruise in late June. She conducted carrier qualifications along the way for her new pilots, and one of the aviators she qualified was Lieutenant Junior Grade David McCampbell, who would go on to become the Navy's top fighter ace of World War II, with 34 aerial victories to his credit. After completing her shakedown cruise, Wasp spent the next several months once again operating off the East Coast, conducting drills and sea trials, until finally being declared fit for duty in early October. Assigned to Carrier Division 3, she got underway on October 11th with the U.S. Army Air Corps' 8th Pursuit Group, embarked to conduct tests to compare the takeoff runs of Navy and Army aircraft. This experiment marked the first time that U.S. Army aircraft operated from a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. From mid-October to late November, Wasp operated in the Guantanamo Bay area, training her air crews and gunners. She spent Christmas at the Norfolk Navy Yard before returning to Guantanamo Bay in late January for more training, which lasted into early March. While returning to Norfolk on March 7th, she sailed into a raging nor'easter off the Cape Hatteras coast, and at about 10:45 that night, a lookout spotted a red flare in the distance piercing the stormy darkness. Soon, a second flare was observed, and Wasp began searching for the stranger in the night. About half an hour later, she found the 152-foot lumber schooner George E. Clink floundering in the heavy seas and effected the rescue of her 8-man crew. In a marvelous act of seamanship, Wasp maneuvered alongside the stricken vessel, which allowed 4 members of her crew to climb up a swaying Jacob's ladder to safety. Wasp's crew then lowered a whaleboat and brought the remaining 4 men aboard without incident. Wasp then continued on to Norfolk, where she disembarked her rescued passengers before heading into the dry dock at the Navy Yard. Her turbines were repaired, and all of her portholes on the third deck were welded over to provide better watertight integrity. Steel splinter shielding around her 5-inch and 1.1-inch batteries was also added, and she received her first radar set, the CXAM-1. After this work was completed, she got underway, and until mid-July operated off the U.S. East Coast training and supporting the Atlantic Fleet's neutrality patrols to protect American shipping from German U-boats. After returning to Norfolk in mid-July, Wasp was given the assignment of delivering U.S. Army planes to Iceland as part of the U.S. occupation of that island. She got underway on July 28th, with 30 Army P-40s and 3 training aircraft of the 33rd Pursuit Squadron tied down to her flight deck. After launching her cargo on August 6th, Wasp returned again to the U.S. East Coast and would resume training and conducting neutrality patrols until December. As the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, Wasp was anchored in Grassy Bay, Bermuda, observing a holiday routine with it being a Sunday. News of the attack soon broke, and she got underway a few days later with her escorts to dissuade the Vichy French warships in the West Indies from attempting a breakout run back to France. As it turned out, American intelligence was incorrect, and the Vichy French warships were still where they should be in the West Indies. So Wasp headed stateside for an overhaul at the Norfolk Navy Yard that would last into early 1942. Upon completion of her overhaul in mid-January, Wasp headed north and operated off the Newfoundland and Maine coasts for the next several months before being detached in late March to reinforce the British home fleet. British naval strength in the North Atlantic had been weakened considerably by the need to send units elsewhere, the Mediterranean in particular, and Wasp was needed to help counter surface elements of the German Navy that were based in occupied Norway. On April 5th, she arrived at the Royal Navy base at Scapa Flow in the company of the new fast battleship USS Washington and the heavy cruiser Wichita. While Washington and Wichita began familiarizing themselves with their counterparts in the Royal Navy, Wasp weighed anchor on the 14th to begin the first of her 2 runs to the island of Malta in the Mediterranean Sea. Her mission on both occasions was to deliver badly needed RAF Spitfires to the British garrison that was defending the island from Axis forces. A second run to Malta was deemed necessary after many of the Spitfires were shot up on the ground shortly after arriving on April 20th. This run commenced on May 3rd, and Wasp and HMS Eagle delivered their charges on the 9th with no difficulties. As she retired towards England, German radio falsely reported, much like they would Ranger in 1943, that they had sunk Wasp. This obviously wasn't the case, and due to operational losses in the Pacific Theater during the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, Wasp hurried back to the States for alterations and repairs to prepare her for service with the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Wasp departed Norfolk on June 6th, in the company of the new fast battleship North Carolina, cruisers Quincy and San Juan, and 6 destroyers. The group transited the Panama Canal on June 10th and became Task Force 18. After a brief stay in San Diego to embark the rest of her air group, she got underway and arrived in the Tonga Islands on July 18th. Along the way, though, she developed serious engine trouble. Her starboard turbine, even at low speed, was making a loud scraping noise. This limited her to the use of only her port engine and a speed of 15 knots, which left air operations entirely dependent on a favorable wind. The ship's black gang or engine room crew worked diligently to do the preliminary work on the ship's starboard high-pressure turbine while en route to Tongatabu, which allowed for the speedy completion of the repairs upon her arrival. Wasp's next assignment, together with the carriers Saratoga and Enterprise, was to the support force under Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher for the invasion of Guadalcanal. Under the tactical command of Rear Admiral Lee Noyes, embarked in Wasp, the carriers were to provide air support for the invasion. The great struggle for Guadalcanal kicked off on the morning of August 7th, when 84 miles from Tulagi and 1 hour before the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the first planes were brought up and spotted for the morning's launch. A fresh breeze whipped across Wasp's darkened flight deck as plane handlers and ordnance men moved about. At 5:30, The first planes roared down her deck and into the air. 16 F-4Fs and 15 SBDs raced towards their targets and respective hunting grounds. The Wildcats strafed Japanese installations on Tulagi, Gavatu, and Tanambogo, while the SBDs made quick work of fortifications and installations on Florida Island and Guadalcanal. The Japanese were caught flat-footed by the attacks and offered very little in the way of resistance. Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise, with their screens, retired to the south at nightfall after a successful day of strikes over the eastern Solomons. Wasp returned the next morning, intent on providing a continuous combat air patrol over the landing beaches and transports until noon. The Japanese sent a large strike from Bougainville, and this day would wind up being marked by epic air battles between Wasp's aviators and their Japanese counterparts. Wildcats, and even SBDs, traded blows with the Japanese throughout the area before Wasp retired late that afternoon. After the initial action in the Solomons campaign on the 7th and 8th, Wasp spent the next month patrolling and covering convoys and resupply units heading to Guadalcanal. She missed participating in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th, after she had been ordered to the south to refuel by Admiral Fletcher, and was too far away to respond to the Japanese threat in time. With Enterprise being banged up during the battle, and Saratoga being torpedoed a week later, Wasp would find herself as one of the 2 operational U.S. flat-tops left in the South Pacific as the calendar flipped to September. On September 15, 1942, Wasp was escorting a convoy which was carrying Marine reinforcements to Guadalcanal. Wasp's task force was operating about 150 miles southeast of San Cristobal Island, in an area referred to as Torpedo Junction, by U.S. sailors due to repeated sightings and attacks by Japanese submarines in the area. She had drawn the job of ready duty carrier for the day, and as such, her gasoline system was in use, and her aircraft were being refueled and rearmed for anti-submarine and combat air patrols. At 2:20, she turned into the wind to launch and recover planes. This was done fairly quickly, and her deck crew began refueling and respotting planes as Wasp turned to starboard. She had 37 planes on her hangar deck, and 8 more sitting on her flight deck being refueled and rearmed. As fate would have it, when her task force turned into the wind, they maneuvered right into the path of a Japanese submarine, who had initially been well out of range to make an attack when first sighting the U.S. ships. Suddenly, at 2:45, a lookout spotted 3 torpedoes in the water and heading for Wasp. He called out a warning into his talker, and her captain, Forrest P. Sherman, ordered her rudder hard over to starboard. But it was too late at that point, and 2, possibly 3 torpedoes slammed into her in quick succession amidships on her starboard side. The torpedoes hit Wasp in the vicinity of her gas tanks and magazines, with one even breaching the water and striking her slightly above the waterline. Fiery blasts ripped through the forward parts of Wasp. Aircraft on the flight and hangar decks were thrown about as if they were toys. Massive fires broke out throughout the ship, and soon, the heat of the intense fires detonated the ready ammunition for the forward anti-aircraft guns on the starboard side, and fragments showered the forward part of the ship, and her No. 2 1.1-inch mount was blown overboard. Her forward water mains were rendered inoperable by the explosions, so no water was available to fight the fire forward. As the ship listed 10 to 15 degrees to starboard, oil and gasoline released from the tanks by the torpedo hit, caught fire on the water. Sherman slowed the stricken carrier to 10 knots and maneuvered to try to get the wind in a favorable direction in an attempt to keep the fire forward. At that point, Wasp's communication circuits went dead. Within 24 minutes of the initial attack, 3 additional major gasoline vapor explosions had occurred. After consulting with Noyes, Sherman ordered "abandon ship" at 3:20. All badly injured men were lowered into rafts or rubber boats. Many of the able-bodied men had to abandon from aft because of the forward fires. This process took nearly 40 minutes to complete, and at 4 o'clock, satisfied that no one alive was left on board, Captain Sherman went over the side of his ship and into the sea. All of her planes that were aloft at the time of the attack found their way to Hornet and landed safely, except for one. But Wasp's ordeal was not over. She drifted with her dead as the fires worked their way aft and 4 more violent explosions boomed out as night began to fall. Her dead numbered 193, and she had another 366 wounded. The destroyer Lansdowne was ordered to torpedo her and stand by until she sank. Lansdowne's Mark 15 torpedoes had the same flaws as the Mark 14 torpedoes that were causing headaches for the U.S. submarine fleet. Her first two attempts did not detonate. The magnetic influence exploders on her three remaining torpedoes were disabled, and their running depth was set at 10 feet. All three torpedoes detonated in her second attempt, but Wasp remained afloat and on fire into the night, before finally sinking bow first at around 9 o'clock. Wasp had been struck by what would end up being one of the most successful torpedo spreads ever fired in the history of underwater warfare. The Japanese submarine fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at Wasp. 3 struck her, 2 passed ahead of her and passed astern of the light cruiser Helena before hitting the destroyer USS O'Brien minutes later and over 5 miles away in Hornet's task force. Damage from this torpedo eventually led to O'Brien's sinking a month later. The 6th torpedo passed either astern or under Wasp, narrowly missed Lansdowne and Wasp's screen, and struck North Carolina, who was also operating in Hornet's screen. The torpedo strike would put the giant new battle wagon out of commission until mid-November. Wasp's fate was sealed on the slipway she was built on. Her thin armor and inadequate torpedo protection, coupled with the U.S. Navy's lack of damage control experience, proved to be fatal. The Navy would use her sinking, as well as others, to redefine the art of damage control and fighting shipborne fires, and by 1945, many other U.S. ships would be saved, thanks to the lessons learned on Wasp. In January 2019, the wreck of Wasp was discovered by the research vessel Petrel at a depth of 14,000 feet in the eastern edge of Torpedo Junction. She sits upright on the ocean floor with her hull buried in the mud and her planes scattered all over her wreck site. She is more than just a wreck, though. She is a grave to the men who perished that day in that horrific inferno, their lives violently cut short. May they rest in peace with the thanks of a grateful nation. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.